Imagine a world built not on gold, not on hard assets, but on a promise. A promise backed by the sheer, undeniable will of a nation that had just emerged from global conflict as the undisputed economic titan. This is the story of how the United States, in the span of a few decades, managed to weave an intricate web of credit around the globe, effectively purchasing influence, resources, and stability using nothing more tangible than faith in the greenback. Forget what you think you know about national budgets. This narrative dives deep into the architecture of debt that became the invisible scaffolding of American global power. Our journey begins not in a Wall Street boardroom, but in the misty summer air of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944. The world was shattered, desperately needing an anchor. And the anchor it received was the US dollar, pegged to gold at $$/$35 an ounce. This system, established by the world's most powerful creditor nation, was brilliant, ruthless, and, critically, temporary. For 20 years, this arrangement served its purpose, fostering global trade, stabilizing currencies, and making the dollar synonymous with the safest store of value on earth. Every central bank held dollars. Every international transaction defaulted to the dollar. America was not just wealthy, it was the banker to the world. But here's the rub, the fundamental tension that sets our entire saga in motion. To supply the world with the dollars it needed to trade, dollars that the world trusted, the US had to continuously send more dollars out than it brought in. This meant running persistent balance of payments deficits. We were, in effect, printing money for the world's commerce. Think of it as the ultimate pyramid scheme, except this pyramid was stabilizing the global economy, at least initially. The key figure in this early chapter isn't a politician, but the economic consensus itself, which dictated that America's economic health was the world's economic health. This created an insatiable global appetite for US Treasury securities, debt instruments, because holding them was the surest way to hold the world's reserve currency. Nations traded their real goods and services for paper obligations from the US government. Now, fast forward to the late 1960s. The world is booming, but the US is facing a new challenge: the escalating, expensive, and ultimately unwinnable war in Vietnam, coupled with ambitious domestic social programs, the Great Society. The financial chickens were starting to come home to roost. Countries like France and Germany, who had accumulated massive piles of dollars through trade surpluses with the US, began to look critically at the ratio. They reasoned, the US has promised to exchange these dollars for gold on demand, but does the US actually have enough gold to back the sheer volume of dollars now sloshing around the globe? They started asking for the metal. The demand for gold redemption spiked. The pressure on Fort Knox became immense. The illusion, sustained by mutual trust and post-war optimism, was beginning to fracture under the weight of reality and overcommitment. The game had to change, or the whole foundation would collapse. And change it did, in one of the most consequential economic decisions of the 20th century, a move that unleashed the next, far more volatile, chapter of America's debt-fueled expansion. This moment, this unpegging, is where the true era of buying the world with pure, unbacked debt begins, shifting the risk entirely onto the shoulders of every other nation. This wasn't just a policy shift. It was the severing of a tether, launching the US dollar, and by extension, the global economy, into a new, uncharted sea of fiat currency, floating exchange rates, and ever-increasing leverage. It was the ultimate economic gamble, trading tangible security for flexible, boundless, potentially catastrophic, credit expansion. We are about to witness the transition from the dollar as an asset to the dollar as an IOU, a global contract written in perpetual deficit. The sheer audacity of it is breathtaking. A strategy that demands global compliance simply because the alternative, a sudden, coordinated withdrawal from the dollar system, is unthinkable for every major trading partner, yet the cracks are widening, and the pressure to spend, to borrow, to maintain this sprawling global empire only intensifies, creating a feedback loop where debt is no longer a weakness, but the very mechanism of control, the very engine of the machine. The stage is set for the massive accumulation of debt that will define the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the hidden cost of American exceptionalism, the silent transfer of real wealth for nominal promises, a story written in ledger books across continents, demanding constant vigilance and an ever-growing supply of new credit to keep the illusion from dissolving into panic. The gold standard was a physical chain. Its removal was the unlocking of an infinite printing press, a power that has been wielded with increasing frequency and diminishing restraint, leading us to the precarious cliff edge where we stand today, forever indebted to the future for the comforts of the present. The dramatic scene from Prompt 1, the moment the tether to gold was severed, was more than a mere policy change. It was a fundamental shift in the very nature of global money, an audacious leap of faith into a purely fiat world. On August 15, 1971, when President Richard Nixon announced the temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility to gold, a temporary measure that became permanent, he didn't just close the gold window, he flung open the floodgates of global credit and, crucially, redefined what a nation's debt truly meant. The immediate fallout was chaotic. Currencies across the globe began to float, subject to the whims of speculators and the pressures of sovereign policy, causing intense anxiety in capitals from Tokyo to London. But amidst this currency chaos, the American strategy began to crystallize, not just as a defensive measure, but as the blueprint for an entirely new, debt-fueled global empire. The dollar was no longer valuable because it was backed by gold. It was valuable because it was demanded for something else, something absolutely essential to the modern industrial world. That something, of course, was oil. This brings us to the second, equally brilliant, and far more geopolitically significant component of America's new debt machine, the petrodollar system. The 1973 oil crisis, triggered by geopolitical conflict and the strategic use of oil as a weapon, saw global oil prices skyrocket. This created an immediate problem for the world but an unexpected opportunity for the US. Oil-exporting nations, particularly those in the Middle East, were suddenly awash in staggering, unprecedented amounts of money, dollars. Because, even without the gold backing, oil was still widely priced in the greenback due to historical convention. The US, spearheaded by key diplomatic and financial negotiations in the mid-1970s, brokered a historic, silent, and monumental agreement, primarily with Saudi Arabia. The core of the deal was elegantly simple and terrifyingly effective. Saudi Arabia would agree to price all its oil exports exclusively in US dollars, and, critically, would reinvest its massive surplus dollar revenues, the petrodollars, into US Treasury securities, effectively lending the money back to the US government. In exchange, the United States promised unwavering military support and security for the Saudi kingdom. This seemingly technical arrangement was a stroke of economic genius for America, instantaneously solving its two biggest post-Bretton Woods problems. Firstly, it created an unshakable, artificial, and massive global demand for the US dollar. Every nation, whether importing oil from Saudi Arabia or any other OPEC member who soon followed suit, was forced to first acquire US dollars to complete the transaction. This ensured that the dollar remained the world's primary reserve and trade currency, maintaining its perceived stability despite being nothing more than paper backed by government trust. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly for our story of debt, the petrodollar recycling mechanism guaranteed a perpetual, low-cost source of financing for the American government. When Saudi Arabia, and later other oil exporters, invested their massive dollar surpluses into US Treasury bonds, they were essentially providing vast, continuous loans to the US. This influx of capital kept American interest rates lower than they otherwise would have been and allowed the US government to run persistently large budget deficits, to buy the world with debt, without the crippling interest costs that would doom any other nation attempting the same strategy. The world was forced to pay the US for its energy in dollars, and then the sellers of that energy were compelled to lend a significant portion of those dollars back to the US government, financing the very military-industrial machine that guaranteed the arrangement. It was a perfectly circular, self-sustaining system, giving the US what is famously called the exorbitant privilege, the right to essentially print the money that the rest of the world must use for its most vital commodity, and then profit from its subsequent recirculation back into US debt markets. This financial alchemy was the true foundation of America's post-71 global dominance, a quiet, non-violent form of economic compulsion. The impact was manifold. It enabled massive military expansion without commensurate tax increases. It fueled decades of consumerism by keeping borrowing costs down, and it locked global financial systems into an inescapable dependency on American monetary policy and debt instruments. This system, however, came with a hidden price tag, which leads directly to the next critical chapter in our story: the global financialization and the invention of ever more complex forms of debt that would ultimately leverage this enormous petrodollar flow into the risky instruments that eventually led to a global credit bubble, transforming the simple, elegant debt for oil trade into a complex, destabilizing global financial machine powered by the very deficits the petrodollar system made so cheap to run. The stage is set for the rise of Wall Street as the unchallenged global financial hub, acting as the ultimate recycler and multiplier of the world's forced investment in American promises. The debt machine was now operational, running on fiat currency and fueled by oil. But the most significant and ultimately destabilizing phase of America's global financial dominance involved a new player that mastered the art of exploiting this debt system: China. While the petrodollar recycling system provided the bedrock of dollar demand, China's entry onto the global stage, culminating with its ascension into the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2001, created an economic feedback loop that was, in many ways, the perfection of America's debt strategy and its ultimate undoing. This story is a tale of two colossal imbalances: American consumption and debt versus Chinese manufacturing and savings. China pursued an explicit, export-led growth model. They manufactured virtually everything the insatiable American consumer demanded, and they did it at low cost, leading to enormous, persistent trade surpluses with the United States. But this flood of manufactured goods created a tremendous problem for the Chinese central bank. Every time a Chinese exporter sold goods to an American buyer, they received US dollars. To prevent this sudden, massive influx of dollars from skyrocketing the value of the yuan, which would make their exports instantly more expensive and non-competitive, the Chinese central bank intervened aggressively in the foreign exchange market. They would effectively print yuan to buy up the incoming US dollars. And what did they do with those trillions of acquired US dollars? They did what the Saudis had done a generation earlier, but on a scale the world had never witnessed. They bought US Treasury securities. China became, by the late 2000s, the single largest foreign financier of the United States. This created a profound, almost symbiotic financial relationship, often described as Chimerica. China was funding America's consumption, lending the US the money to buy the very goods China produced. The economic effect was mesmerizing and destructive. American debt financed cheap Chinese goods, which kept US inflation low despite massive domestic spending, and simultaneously kept US interest rates low thanks to China's bottomless demand for US bonds. This dynamic fueled the growth of the financial debt machine we discussed in the last segment. Wall Street leveraged the low interest rates and the perceived safety of the US financial system, which was anchored by this continuous foreign financing. The low cost of capital, provided by the global savings glut, a term coined to describe the massive capital inflows from China and other surplus countries, did not go into productive infrastructure. It went primarily into real estate and consumer credit. But because China's central bank, in its desperate need to sterilize its currency inflows, was mainly buying the safest assets, short-term US government debt. This lowered the cost of all US debt, pushing investors out of safe government bonds and into the more complex, higher yield, and ultimately riskier instruments Wall Street was churning out, the very mortgage-backed and asset-backed securities built on subprime loans and easy credit. The sheer volume of Chinese dollar accumulation was so vast, and the forced recycling back into the US was so consistent, that it guaranteed a period of unprecedented credit expansion. Foreign capital was not just passively investing, it was actively enabling and demanding the creation of the low-quality, high-volume debt that became the foundation of the 2008 housing bubble. The American household was borrowing money, much of it indirectly provided by the savings of Chinese factory workers, to buy goods and assets, driving up prices and creating a colossal, global-scale bubble of credit. By 2007, the system had reached its maximum leverage. The simple, physical goods manufactured in Asia had been paid for not with US wealth, but with US promises that were packaged, resold, and insured across the entire global financial system. The structure of debt, from the consumer mortgage to the complex global security, had become too tall, too intertwined, and fundamentally reliant on the impossible promise of perpetual American solvency and consumption. The moment the underlying American borrower, the homeowner or the credit card holder, failed, the ripple effect would not stop at the bank's balance sheet. It would travel instantly, electronically, and globally to the pension fund in Europe and the sovereign wealth fund in Asia. The world had bought into America's debt, not just through choice, but through the irresistible pull of the petrodollar and the necessities of global trade, and that shared debt was about to turn toxic on a planetary scale, proving that debt, when leveraged to this extreme, becomes a weapon of mass financial destruction that spares neither the borrower nor the unwitting global lender. The stage is set for the inevitable collapse, the moment when the world finally realizes that the paper it holds is backed by nothing more than the shattered pieces of the housing market and the confidence game that underpins all fiat currency. The elaborate, globalized mechanism built on the foundations of fiat currency, petrodollars, and securitized mortgages had reached its breaking point. For years, the system relied on the mathematical illusion that housing prices would never fall everywhere at once and that the debt written on the backs of American consumers was eternally valuable. But the music stopped. In 2007, the first cracks appeared as defaults on subprime mortgages began to spike. By 2008, the cracks had turned into a seismic rupture, and the world was forced to watch as the beautifully complex, yet utterly fraudulent, house of debt came crashing down. The pivotal moment, the event that turned a severe financial crisis into a global panic, was the spectacular collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008. This wasn't just another bankruptcy, it was the psychological signal that the too-big-to-fail era had ended for some institutions, unleashing a torrent of fear that froze the lifeblood of the global economy, credit. Banks stopped lending to each other, because no one knew who was holding the next tranche of toxic debt. The next mortgage-backed security, MBS, sliced and diced into oblivion. The risk, which Wall Street had so cleverly distributed across the globe, instantly snapped back to the center, threatening to take down every major financial institution, not just in the US, but in Europe, Asia, and everywhere that had recycled their surpluses back into the American debt machine. Pension funds in Scandinavia, central banks in China, and local governments in Europe suddenly realized that their safe investments in high-yield American paper were worthless. The global economy, previously buoyant on a sea of cheap credit, began to sink into the Great Recession. But the most fascinating part of this chapter isn't the collapse itself, but the radical policy response, a response that fundamentally deepened the world's reliance on American debt, transferring massive private liability directly onto the public ledger. The moment required a total financial reinvention, where the creation of debt became the only immediate solution to the problem of too much debt. First came the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, a controversial $700 billion government injection designed to stabilize the financial system by buying up the toxic assets or, ultimately, injecting capital directly into the largest banks, deemed systemically important. The goal was to replace illiquid, risky private debt with safe, government-backed public debt. But this was only the start of the massive debt creation. When interest rates, the traditional tool of central banks, hit zero, policymakers turned to the unthinkable quantitative easing, QE. The Federal Reserve and later other major central banks began digitally creating massive amounts of new money to purchase long-term assets, primarily government bonds and mortgage-backed securities, in the open market. This was debt monetization on an unimaginable scale. QE was the ultimate act of leveraging the dollar's exorbitant privilege. By creating trillions of new dollars to buy up debt, the Fed essentially injected trillions in liquidity into the financial system, stabilizing asset prices and ensuring the global financial architecture didn't shatter entirely. But in doing so, they drastically expanded the US public debt, the Fed's balance sheet swelled to unprecedented size, and, critically, cemented the dependence of the global economy on this new, enormous supply of fiat credit. The system had been saved, but the cost was a fundamental shift. The risk, which started in private subprime loans, was now overwhelmingly shouldered by the US taxpayer, and the stability of the global financial system was now explicitly tied to the permanent expansion of the US central bank's balance sheet, meaning the permanent expansion of American debt. The world was forced to watch as the US government took on massive new debts and the US central bank conjured trillions more, all to rescue the very financiers whose packaged debt the world had bought. This created a profound, structural change where the line between government debt and central bank money creation became dangerously blurred, setting the stage for the global economy to become addicted to emergency, ultra-cheap money, perpetually deferring the inevitable reckoning for the debt they used to buy the world. This is the ultimate paradox. The solution to the debt crisis was to print more of the currency that caused the crisis, trusting that the world's need for a safe reserve asset, the dollar, would override any concern about its sheer volume or its lack of a physical anchor. The immediate panic of 2008 was averted, but the cure imposed a long-term, structural sickness on the global economy. By injecting trillions in new debt and forcing interest rates to near-zero levels through successive rounds of quantitative easing, the US and its central bank guaranteed the survival of the system, but in doing so, they engineered a world addicted to unnaturally cheap money. This new era, the age of zero interest, fundamentally altered the incentives of global capital and set the stage for the next wave of crises. The flood of liquidity, created by the Fed to stabilize the financial sector, didn't trickle down to the average consumer or worker in the form of higher wages or faster economic growth. Instead, it surged straight back into financial markets, inflating a massive, new bubble of asset prices. Stocks, bonds, real estate, and exotic assets around the world soared in value, decoupled from the underlying, sluggish economic growth. This was the unintended, yet inevitable, side effect of treating a solvency crisis with a liquidity solution. Debt was still the engine, but now it was masked by astronomical asset valuations, making the rich richer and widening the already gaping chasm of global wealth inequality. The world realized that the US had essentially secured its own solvency by guaranteeing that the cost of its debt, the interest rate, would remain negligible for over a decade. This strategy, however, had a profoundly chilling effect on America's major trading partners and foreign creditors. Nations like China, which still held trillions in US Treasury bonds as the foundation of their national savings, realized they were receiving near-zero return on the vast wealth they had lent the US. The exorbitant privilege of the dollar was being used, in the eyes of the global South, not just for trade convenience, but as a mechanism to transfer real wealth from global savers to American consumers and asset holders. This realization sparked the beginnings of a serious, coordinated de-dollarization effort. It wasn't a wholesale, chaotic abandonment of the dollar, but a subtle, persistent movement of diversification. Key economies, tired of being held hostage by a financial system that could freeze their dollar assets or impose sanctions at the whim of US policy, began searching for alternatives. This included nations organizing under the banner of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, openly discussing trade settlement in local currencies, establishing parallel payment infrastructures, and aggressively accumulating physical gold reserves as a hedge against the fiat debt world. China, still America's largest foreign creditor, started actively shifting trade settlements, especially for massive energy imports and its ambitious Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) projects, into yuan-denominated agreements. For the first time since the Petrodollar system was established, the guaranteed demand for the dollar began to erode at the margins. The global financial landscape was evolving into a multipolar system, one where the debt of the world's leading consumer nation was increasingly viewed not as the ultimate safe haven, but as a potential liability, subject to the unpredictable whims of US fiscal and monetary policy. This rising geopolitical tension, the clash between America's limitless debt appetite and the world's diminishing willingness to automatically finance it, is the central conflict of the modern global economy. The US, confident in the structural inertia of the dollar system, continued to rack up unprecedented levels of public debt, implicitly embracing the concepts of modern monetary theory, MMT, the idea that a government sovereign in its own currency can simply print what it needs until inflation appears. But inflation, largely suppressed for a decade by cheap Chinese imports and globalization, was lurking, ready to burst out from the accumulated debt once real-world constraints, like supply chain disruptions and geopolitical conflict, forced the price of real goods to rise. The world that America bought with its debt, a world of cheap imports and perpetually low borrowing costs, was becoming increasingly fragile, fueled by an artificial credit expansion that enriched the few while simultaneously alienating the many who financed it. The debt was no longer a lubricant for trade, it was a looming geopolitical vulnerability, threatening to unwind the very economic consensus that had defined the past 50 years. This creates a moment of extreme tension. The global structure depends on U.S. debt remaining desirable, yet the actions taken to manage that debt actively erode its desirability for the nations that matter most. We arrive at the culmination of this immense, decades-long experiment. How America bought the world with debt. The financial crash was addressed by doubling down on the very mechanism that caused it, debt, but the act of rescue had two critical, final consequences that define our present and future. The first consequence was the weaponization of the dollar. The immense political and financial capital spent saving the system in 2008 demonstrated to the world just how essential the US-controlled financial architecture was. In the years that followed, particularly with rising geopolitical tensions, the US government began to explicitly leverage this system, using its control over dollar transactions, banking access, and the SWIFT messaging network as a powerful tool of foreign policy, a new form of economic warfare. The ability to instantly freeze assets, cut off a nation's banks from the dollar system, or impose sanctions became a powerful non-military weapon. While effective in the short term, this overuse inadvertently provided the final, irresistible push for countries like China and the BRICS coalition to seriously accelerate their de-dollarization efforts. Because the very safety they sought by holding dollars, the currency's perceived neutrality, had been irrevocably shattered. The central banks that once automatically recycled their surpluses into U.S. debt now saw that debt not merely as a low-yielding investment, but as a potential liability subject to seizure. This is the ultimate, self-inflicted wound. Turning the world's greatest financial asset into a geopolitical instrument ensures its gradual erosion as the global standard. The second and perhaps most immediate consequence was the inevitable return of inflation. For a decade, the trillions created by QE and ultra-low rates were largely absorbed by asset markets and kept stable by the torrent of cheap Chinese manufactured goods. But the extreme supply shock of the early 2020s, coupled with massive government stimulus, essentially applying MMT principles in practice, finally provided the spark that ignited the enormous reservoir of fiat money created since 2008. The debt that had been so easily managed at zero interest suddenly carried a heavy real-world cost, a generalized rise in prices that eroded the purchasing power of the dollar, not just for American consumers, but for every nation holding dollar reserves. This is the final brutal twist of the story. The most sophisticated method of debt management, unbacked currency creation, ultimately pays off its debt not with real assets, but by subtly stealing value through inflation, a hidden tax on everyone who holds the dollar. As we look forward, the world system stands at an unprecedented, knife-edge moment. The U.S. national debt continues to climb to historic highs, yet the world's financial markets remain dependent on the liquidity provided by U.S. treasuries. The global financial system is split between the established G7 nations, who still rely on the dollar's network effects, and the emerging powers, actively building parallel financial rails powered by gold, local currencies, and new technologies. The story of how America bought the world with debt is therefore not over. It simply enters its final, most volatile act. The initial contract signed in Bretton Woods, where dollars were tethered to gold, has been replaced by a new, unspoken contract where the dollar is tethered only to global necessity and geopolitical inertia. But that necessity is waning, and that inertia is being challenged. The ultimate fate of the world's economy rests on an almost philosophical question. Can faith in the U.S. political and military architecture perpetually outpace the corrosive arithmetic of endless debt and intentional devaluation? The magnificent edifice built on credit has brought a half-century of stability, cheap goods, and global supremacy to America, purchased not with blood or gold, but with the world's patience and its forced confidence in an endless IOU. But the bill, once conveniently deferred and diversified, is finally coming due, not in a single catastrophic collapse, but in the slow, grinding erosion of value and the fracturing of the global financial order. The grand illusion, perfected over 80 years, is beginning to fade, revealing a world where many debts are owed, few can be repaid, and the cost will be shared by every single participant, whether borrower or lender, friend or adversary.